am very pleased to be the interim director of the Sanford Institute for Empathy and Compassion. We're about 3.5 years old. The Institute was made possible by a gift from Denny Sanford, and his goal in life has been to be a compassionate human being and to help others show compassion. The Institute has 2 pillars. One is a pillar focused on the neurobiology of empathy and compassion, and the other focuses on its application, its use in real time and with real people. The first folks that we address are medical students who are trying to hold on to their empathy and compassion as they become doctors, and clinical faculty. But in time, we would like for whatever we learn, both at the basic level and in the applied level, to be widely available to the world. And in this process, we really would love to collaborate with you. It's impossible for, I think, any institution to create a true critical mass of individuals, 10, 15 faculty for, let's say, either in the basic or the applied elements. But working with you, the real experts, the real people who live their lives for this kind of work, we can create a critical mass, a virtual critical mass. So we invite you to think about us, to go to empathyandcompassion.ucsd.edu to come talk to me about your ideas. We'd love to hear them, and we'd love to work with you. So this session is entitled Non-Duality and Self-Transcendence, Converging Evidence and Relevance. I'm not an expert on non-dualism, but I don't like dualism much. I don't understand how Descartes could have gotten it so wrong, but dualism separates mind and body and bifurcates spirit and matter. In the past, dichotomous models of thinking supported by dualism dominated the world of philosophy and science. However, the emergence of neuroscience and the more recent emergence of social neuroscience has enabled us to reconsider dualism and has made possible pursuit of theories that reject it, ergo, those considered under non-dualism, of which there are several. As a result, a newly informed and lively discussion can now address mind and body through a lens that is at the same time philosophical and neuroscientific. So it's an exciting time for this work, and I'm happy that you're here to listen to our exciting speakers. Our first speaker is Hal Roth from Brown University, professor of religious studies. After Hal, we'll hear from Fadel Zidan, who's professor of anesthesia here at UC San Diego. Fadel is a dear friend and colleague whose work in the Institute has really enabled us to do much good work, and I thank him very much for all he's done. Following Fadel will be Lorelei Bernacki from the University of Colorado Boulder, professor of religious studies, and following her will be Eric Garland, University of Utah, distinguished professor of social work. We'd like our speakers to spend about 15 minutes. They may go over a little bit, hopefully not too much because we don't have a lot of time, and have about 20 minutes at the end for a panel discussion. So we'll hold the questions until the end, and then we'll have a free for all at that time. So thanks for being here, and Hal, you're up.
Morgan, would you? Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out at 8:30 and not 9 o'clock. I think some people thought we were starting a little bit later. So I wanted to talk to you today about 2 dimensions of non-duality and perhaps frame a little bit about what we're going to do on the panel. Let's see if the clicker works. Technology, yes. So genesis for the idea for this panel came out of this wonderful Mind and Life International Research Institute in Japan that happened at the beginning of September 2018. And it was very dramatic because on the last day, a typhoon blew up from Osaka Bay, knocking out the Osaka International Airport and blew through the monastery. So we had this on the temple ground of the Myoshinji Monastery, and it was just a wonderful contemplative setting. In many ways, the best setting we ever had. The set, maybe, I don't know, but the setting sure rocked it. And it was at that conference that I gave a talk about no person epistemology, something we've developed in the context of our unique pedagogy that we've developed in our program at Brown. I was talking then about the Zen roots of contemplative studies, and one of the co-organizers, Yoshi Nakamura, said to me, well, you really need to look at the work that we're doing in Utah. The team's led by Eric Garland, and I'm on the team, and Adam Hanley, who I think is here, is on the team. And we're doing this very interesting work with non-dual awareness. Okay, I said I'll take a look. And I was actually surprised at the extent to which their concepts of non-dual awareness work very well with the no-person epistemologies that we've been thinking about at Brown. I was drawn by this phrase from one of their earlier articles that the individuals that they studied report having a greater capacity to decenter from experience. Decentering may loosen the boundaries of the self by encouraging a metacognitive perspective in which one disidentifies from self-referential cognitions and thereby de-reifies the self as the subject of experience. It's a really important idea. So many of you know that we've set the program up and graduated about 55 students in contemplative studies at Brown. And one of the hallmarks of what we do is what we call critical first-person investigation. And that involves teaching students contemplative practices in the context of university courses. The practices themselves match up really well with the readings that we're doing every week. So for example, when we're reading the Satipatthana Sutta in class, but then we'll also do the practices directly from the Satipatthana Sutta in meditation labs. For many years, we had the use of the dance studio, although they eventually threw us out. But anyway, the key was that dancers like to stay up late, but they don't like to get up early. So as long as we got in there at 8 or 9 in the morning, then we were okay. So the pedagogy that we developed there relies on 4 interactive epistemologies. And I'm not going to spend much time on the ones with which you're familiar, which is third person and second person and first person. But what we started talking about there, I guess starting back in 2014, is the idea of no person epistemology. That is immediate, non-intentional, and not processed through a sense of self-identity. It's non-self-referential. It's empirically based on the constant flow of experience. It's immediate experience in the present moment that is not objectified by the first person experiencing subject. So for example, just the very raw experience of in-breathing and out-breathing, or the pure sensation of sound, and intense intuition, the feeling of the body as a whole without objectification, awareness without processing it through self-identity. And from my work as a scholar of comparative mysticism, as a China-based scholar, particularly looking at the classical Taoist tradition, I saw that in many ways, no person epistemologies gave us insights into some of the really important concepts in many different traditions. And if I had the whole morning, I would be happy to tell you about all of these, but I'm just going to focus on a couple of them. So these no person epistemologies definitely involve what I would call non-dual cognition. And that's where the link, I think, is made with the non-dual awareness that Eric and his team are involved in. So it's knowing that it's made without reliance on a concept of self-identity. There's a lot of that that goes on actually that we're not normally aware of. So if ontology is the study of what we know or what we think we know, underlies the world, what we know underlies the world. And epistemology is the study of how we know that. In many of the examples I'm about to show you, epistemological non-duality is based upon ontological non-duality. And that's really a question for my scientist colleagues, the extent to which their working with epistemological non-dualities relies upon an implicit or explicit non-dual ontology. Certainly in the traditions I'm about to show you, it does. Right, so non-dual epistemology is knowing or cognition that is independent of the dualistic separation of self and other, and it does not depend on a self concept. Non-dual ontology means that there's a power, force, field, energy, entity, consciousness, mind, be that monistic, pluralistic, or theistic, material or immaterial, that underlies the phenomenal world of things and appearances. These are very closely intertwined in my home tradition, which is classical Taoism, and in Chan and Zen, from which I'll give you a couple of quick examples at the end of my talk. So many of you have heard of Taoism, classical Taoism. The Taoist tradition really changed over time significantly, but certain parts of the tradition, its cosmology and its self-cultivation or practices really have remained consistent since the origins. These are portraits of the two founders, Zhuangzi and Lao Tzu. It's nice that they posed for portraits. Very thoughtful of them, but they lived in the 4th centuries BC and so on. It's one of the two indigenous religions and philosophies in China. According to tradition, it was founded by this shadowy figure named Lao Tzu, which means old master. He lived in the 6th century BCE. He schooled Confucius, his main rival, on how to correctly perform the essential practice of rituals, which are the essential practices of that tradition. Then on his way west out of China, he was asked to write down his teachings and also pose for a portrait. And the result is the Tao Te Ching, often translated as the way and its power, the way and its potency. It's the single most famous book in Chinese culture, and there's hundreds of translations into Western languages. Most of them by people who can't read Chinese, but that's another story. Lao Tzu had many disciples, including Zhuangzi, he's my man, you know, Zhuangzi, my favorite author. And there's a work named after him that I'm going to be diving into a little bit. So, however, that's the old picture, the traditional picture. But since the discovery of the famous Ma Wangdui manuscripts, and it's literally 50 years ago, much modern scholarship, including my own, has challenged this view, finding and translating its oldest surviving source, Niya, or inward training, from the Guanzi collection, probably dated to about 350 BCE. I have argued for the existence of a tradition of teachers and students who transmitted a distinctive contemplative practice of apophatic or self-emptying meditation that I've called inner cultivation. Inward training contains the oldest extant discussion of contemplative practices in China and in all of East Asia, and is the first source of this inner cultivation practice. Then 2 centuries later, the famous historian Sima Tan called this inner cultivation tradition Daojia, the family or tradition of the way, hence the term Taoism. That's where all the isms, Confucianism and Taoism, they all arose from that time. Even though the lineages existed, they didn't walk around with labels on their lapels saying I'm a Taoist, or I'm a Confucian, or I'm a legalist, or I'm a Moist, or I'm a Youngist. In these very old sources of this tradition of teachers and students, we see a unique pattern of practices, results, and cosmology in which apophatic, non-dual epistemologies are grounded in a non-dual ontology. This is from Inward Training. I'll just quote it briefly. As for the way, this is the Tao, the power or force that infuses the cosmos. It is what the mouth cannot speak of, the eyes cannot look at, and the ears cannot listen to. It is that by which we cultivate the mind and align the body. The way never has a root or trunk. It never has leaves or flowers. The myriad things are generated by it. The myriad things are completed by it. We designated the way. And then in the famous first chapter of the Tao Te Ching, a way that can be objectified is not the constant way. A name that can be defined is not the constant name. The nameless was the beginning of the heavens and the earth. The named was the mother of the 10,000 things. Therefore, it is always so that if you have no desires, you will contemplate its mysteries. It is always so that if you have desires, you will contemplate its manifestations. These pairs are the same, but are named differently after they emerge. Their sameness is called profound. More profound than profound, it is the gateway to the myriad mysteries. So how do you, now is the power, force, field, energy that transcends the dualism between subject and object. Hence, it is ontologically non-dual. It is the ultimate source of everything in the known universe. In its most profound depths, it can be known to those from whom all desires arising from selfhood are shorn. So it's epistemologically non-dual. Its presence in the world can be known through the desires of the self. And so it's also epistemologically dual. How do we get there? Again, this apophatic emptying practice. This kind of summarizes it, this famous chapter. In the pursuit of learning, we increase every day. But in the pursuit of the way, we decrease every day. We decrease and further decrease until we reach the point of taking no action. No action is undertaken, but nothing is left undone. So self-emptying leads to the complete removal of the intentional intentional activity, including cognition and action, that arises from a fixed sense of self-identity. A form of from this arises effortless action, the famous Wu Wei or Wu Bu Wei. Take no action, but no intentional action, but you accomplish everything. This is a form of non-dual cognition that is seeing and often simultaneously doing. Now, in my favorite text, the Zhuangzi, there are a few more passages, and in the interest of time, I'm going to skip, I think I'll skip this. The fasting of the mind passage, again, talking about emptying out the contents of consciousness or apophatic meditation. The result of it is an awareness in the phenomenal, in the dual work, which is without biases. So this provides the tools to understand non-duality, not just intellectually as a dualistic concept, but directly, empirically, not dependent on self-identity and its concomitant objectification of experiences. This reinforces what we might call a non-dual epistemology of the way. Zhuangzi provides further testimony to the non-dual epistemology in passages like this, where neither it nor other finds its opposite we call the axis of the way. Once the axis is found at the center of the circle, there is no limit to responding to either it or not it. Thus, we say there is nothing better than illumination, the author's term for non-dual awareness. This passage is directly pointing to the Tao as that axis at the center of the circle of experience, a non-duality that, when experienced, enables the adept to have absolutely no personal biases at all, to literally, as I mentioned yesterday in one of the groups, to treat oneself as other. To be no more attached to one's own passions and prejudices to anybody else's. Because then, why can they do this? They are grounded in the ontologically non-dual source of duality, that is the Tao. So we have in Zhuangzi 3 modes of cognition. We have this cognizing by contrivance or fixed cognition, which is essentially dualistic cognition of duality. We then have what Zhuangzi recommends as flowing cognition, which is focused on selfless perception and spontaneous adaptation to the world. So this is non-dual cognition within the world of duality. So it's epistemological non-duality. And then Fong says, from time to time, flowing cognition comes to an end. And when it does, that of which you do not know what is so of it, you call the Tao. So this is non-dual awareness of non-duality. So this is profound an expression of ontological non-duality as anyone can find in the classical Taoist tradition or in any mystical tradition for that matter. We see a stronger non-dual ontology in Chinese Chan Buddhism. And just to summarize this, in the teachings of Huang Bo, the 9th century, famous 9th century Chan master, he says the Buddhas and all sentient beings are only the one mind. There are no other dharmas. And skipping to the next slide, this wonderful, wonderful poem chanted in Zen monasteries all over Japan, all over the world. I quote from Hakuin, the famous 18th century systematizer of Rinzai Zen practice. All beings are originally Buddha, just as ice is originally water. Apart from water, there is no ice. Beyond beings, there is no Buddha. How vast the boundless sky of samadhi. How bright the brilliant moon of wisdom. At this moment, what need is there to seek for anything? That is his calligraphy. So, conclude. From these sources, we see that we can identify 3 modes of cognition. Dualistic cognition of duality, that's what we usually do, and that's up until recently in Western sources and thinkers and researchers, that's all we think there is. However, we're starting to realize now that there can be non-dual cognition of duality. And from these traditions, this is epistemological non-duality. And these traditions that I talked about today, gave some examples about today, talk about non-dual awareness of non-duality. This is total falling away of self and other, subject and object, kind of pure consciousness that you're aware of, but there's no specific content and no self. So these last 2 are realized through apophatic methods that empty the self. In the words of Eric Garland and his partners, these inner cultivation practices decenter and de-reify the self as the subject of experience. And so I want to ask, as we continue this, and I end my talk, is non-dual epistemology grounded in non-dual ontology? Can there be non-dual epistemology without being grounded in a non-dual ontology? And the answer from the Zen tradition is from one of the Roshis I studied with, the abbot of Tenryuji, Kato Ryuho. I don't know if that's, oh yeah, that came across. In front of the window, the moon rises, scattering silver sand. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Morgan. Yeah, yeah, tell me. I have a clock. Okay, I'll give you one day. Okay, thanks. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here early and welcome to our panel. My name is Fadil Zidan. I'm an associate professor of anesthesiology. We're going to be talking about mindfulness and pain and what happens in the brain. And the reason that I first got into studying pain was to appreciate the moment-to-moment experience of our consciousness. Pain is cultivated, modulated by an interaction, a constellation of interactions between the sensory, the cognitive, the affective dimensions of our being. And so when I first got into this, it was just a really neat way to time lock salient conscious experience in real time that maybe could help us then disentangle some of the mechanisms supporting the modulation of awareness as it relates to health. So we'll be talking about pain, and I'm just going to give you like a year-long course in pain physiology, and it's like a slide. So basically, pain needs a brain. There are no pain pathways, okay? And so there is nociceptive pathways, which are where you get a site of injury, and the sensory neuron takes this nociceptive information into the dorsal horn, where then high fives the interneurons, which would then connect with the motor neurons and then remove the limb reflexively from the site of injury. This does not require a cortex. This is just in the spinal cord, the old brain, the reptilian brain. For pain processing, this information goes up the dorsal column and the spinal thalamic pathway into the brain, at which the first entry point will be the thalamus. And the thalamus is one of the coolest areas, one of the most evolved, one of the oldest areas of the brain that is integral to allocating all sensory information to the rest of the brain to elaborate into a conscious experience. And some preliminary work, seminal work, has shown that higher range of noxious stimulation will produce greater activation, deactivation within a distributed neural network that corresponds to processing sensory, affective, and evaluative components of a sensory experience, whether it's innocuous or noxious. However, the greater the noxious range, the greater this activation. What's more interesting and cool, I think, is the fact that this actually is mapped on by subjective experience. So we can quantify one's subjective experience pretty reliably. And what you see here is that the greater the pain report in response to a noxious stimulus, the greater the activation in this distributed network. And folks who are insensitive to noxious stimuli show weaker activation in this distributed network. And I'm telling you this, I'm showing you this because with imaging or looking at the neurophysiology of nociception and pain, we actually have a canvas to play on, to paint on, to see how different mind-body approaches or other techniques can modulate this salient, intrusive, and at times, many times debilitating condition. And now we're graduating from interpreting blobs and making stories about certain blobs and getting a little bit more sophisticated, at least that's what we keep telling ourselves, in the notion of understanding neural networks. And these are how different brain regions activate and deactivate in unison to facilitate a repeatable, reproducible subjective experience. In particular, the default mode network has gained a significant amount of attention and appreciation within the last 20-something years. And the reason is because the default mode network is considered to be an oscillating neural processing areas that correspond to self-reference, to self-appraisal. Some would even say mind wandering when you're driving the car with your family and you're heading to the beach and you're going 75 miles per hour and you got your whole family in there, the most important things, and you're listening to music, but you're nowhere near the car. You're thinking about what you're going to do when you first get to the beach, where you're going to have dinner, what are you going to unpack first. But here you are operating heavy machinery going very fast with your most important luggage in the back, right? And we think that when your mind is mind wandering away from the intended focus, this is where default would be activated. So it's really a neuroprotective network. However, people that have chronic pain, or depression, or anxiety, they have heightened default mode network activity to reflect the rumination and the lack of inability to govern ruminative thought processes. So it's not that mind wandering is bad, it's the content of their mind wandering can lead to maladaptive health. And especially in the context of pain, the posterior nodes of the default mode network, particularly the precuneus, the posterior cingulate cortex, are associated with higher pain and higher comorbid cognitions, depression, anxiety, catastrophizing. So we have also seen some really nice high impact papers show that higher default mode network connectivity is associated with higher chronic pain. So the need for self-regulatory mind-body approaches to attenuate the nociceptive experience is very high. And you will know that, especially in this room, if you go from one lab to the next lab or one contemplative to the next contemplative, you're going to get a likely different operational definition of what mindfulness is. And of course, my laboratory is the correct laboratory, and we define it as awareness of sensory events without reaction that can be cultivated by the practice of mindfulness-based mental training. But you don't need it we see that folks that are more dispositionally mindful using the Freiburg mindfulness inventory feel or report less pain in response to a frankly noxious stimulus without any training. These are meditation naive folks in an N of 76. And what's interesting is that greater deactivation of this posterior node of self-referential default mode network, the precuneus and the PCC, the greater the deactivation in the self-referential network, the higher the dispositional mindfulness, and the lower activity, the lower pain, which was really interesting. We haven't seen that before. So, but what happens when you are trained in mindfulness? And we've seen from a number of papers that extant training, long-term training in mindfulness-based practices, shamatha, vipassana, choice awareness, can produce reliable deactivation in this self-referential network at rest, as if the state at some point develops into a trait. But we live in the West, and a lot of our patients would rather have things be a little bit quicker and easier without some of the extant long-term benefits that may be promised from long-term interventions. So for the last 20-something years, we've really focused on using a very brief mindfulness-based intervention, and this is a shamatha vipassana type practice. Individuals are trained to focus on the changing sensations of the breath. When their mind wanders away from the breath, they're taught to acknowledge it. You can label it. Just don't judge yourself. Don't judge the experience. And doing that by gently returning your attention back to the breath and starting over. You do this over and over and over. And what's unique about our intervention, even though it's brief and whatnot, is that we spend a lot of time in silence. We give very simple instructions and we let our patients struggle through the practice because we feel that's very important. So that's my story on that. And so I'm gonna skip the video here just for the sake of time. Or should I do the video? Well, I'll show you what we do here. So what we do is you'll see that Jackson comes in and he's going to get noxious heat while he meditates. Okay, it's not going to work. So let me just not do that. Okay, so what we did was use across 2 different studies, we used a perfusion imaging technique called arterial spin labeling that provides a direct quantifiable measurement of CVF. And so these are, I think, the first images of a meditating brain that was published in 2011. And what we find is greater activity in the subgenual, it says perigenual, but it's subgenual anterior cingulate cortex predicts analgesia, higher activity here during noxious heat and meditation, greater analgesia, same with right anterior insula and bilateral OFC, all very higher order areas associated with the cognitive modulation of pain. And when folks are receiving noxious heat, we see activation in the primary somatosensory cortex corresponding to the stimulation site, an area that processes the location and the intensity of a feeling. But when folks are meditating, this activation is no longer detectable, suggesting that at least one avenue of pain relief from mindfulness is the attenuation of low-level afferent processes. What we also see across multiple studies is that mindfulness-based analgesia is being driven by widespread deactivation of the thalamus. Nothing from the body, except for the sense of smell, can enter the brain without going through the thalamus. It is considered to be a gatekeeper of many ways of the elaboration of conscious experience. All right, working. Oh, really? Okay, so I'm gonna skip everything and get to the, so we came to a theory that we thought that the orbitofrontal cortex was going to downregulate the thalamus through these really thin GABAergic nuclei called the thalamic reticular nuclei to then reduce the elaboration of nociceptive processing throughout the brain. We tested this theory in a study published by funded by the NCCIH as part of my K99. We basically tested the theory. Is the orbitofrontal cortex exciting the thalamus to then reduce the elaboration of nociceptive processing throughout the brain? And so that was the hypothesis. We used very noxious stimulation to the back of the calf during functional MRI and mindfulness. So we do baseline pain testing. Then they do a 4-session mindfulness intervention or a 4-session book listening intervention. And then they come into the MRI scanner. The first half, they're resting during noxious heat. Second half, they're meditating during noxious heat. If you're in a mindfulness group, or resting if you're in the control group that looks into the natural history of cell burn. I can show you these slides for the methods. Oh yeah, and this paper just came out on Friday, days ago. And so we ran really conservative analyses to test our hypotheses. We used very high conservative thresholds. I'm gonna skip that. And we ran a PPI analysis to appreciate the functional connectivity during noxious heat within the thalamus, i.e. who's the thalamus talking to or not talking to modulate meditation-induced analgesia. No surprise here that meditation reduces pain. There is a long history of this, so that's not surprising. And here are some frequency metrics to show that the controls in MRI2 actually went up from the beginning to the end of the scan. The meditators mostly all went down pretty dramatically. And yeah, this is a beautiful cover. Thank you to Greg Dunn for donating this to us. This is in the February cover issue of 2023 Pain. And we find that when mindfulness is compared to the controls, there's significant deactivation in that distributed network I described in the first slide, particularly in the posterior insula and the bilateral secondary somatosensory cortices, and widespread activation of the dorsal ACC extending into supplementary motor area. Our whole brain, highly conservative regression models found that mindfulness-based analgesia was associated with greater deactivation of the ventral medial PFC. We've not seen this before. We normally would see this activated during modulation of pain. And the reason, what's the VMPFC do? Well, I don't have to tell you, I'll just let the data show you. These are really high impact papers that show that this brain region in particular is responsive to subjective value, affective meaning, self-reflection, which is remarkably consistent with the principles of mindfulness, if you will. And then we tested the hypothesis here and through our region of interest in the thalamus and found that our hypotheses were way wrong, something's signing out. So our hypotheses were way off. It wasn't thalamic PFC innervations, it was the thalamus decoupling from the posterior node of the default mode network. Again, this is thalamic whole brain, so it wasn't ROI to ROI per se, which means that the low-level thalamus is decoupling from the higher-level self-referential processing precuneus. And as you can see here, the slope is pretty steep. This is a strong effect, and it's covariates with pain relief. So what do these two regions do together? A lot. I get it, Linda. Thank you. The thalamus and the precuneus together are associated with self-consciousness. They're the two nodes that both go off first when we lose consciousness, and the first two that come back online when we recover from consciousness. Some elegant papers here, which are remarkably consistent with the premise of the anatta, which says that now that there is no self, but rather your experience is not self, it's not you. So there's this kind of notion that's a little off, like there is no self. There is a self, it's just that your experience doesn't have to be you. And so this is one of the first times that we've seen mindfulness-based, if ever, that mindfulness or that the default mode network can actually be a pain modulatory mechanism, which is super exciting because it gives us a biomechanistic target for future interventions. I want to thank you for your time. I have to acknowledge our funders, the Institute for Empathy and Compassion here at UC San Diego, the National Center for Complementary Integrative Health, Romero Foundation, and the team here is remarkable. If you see them around, they are amazing. They work so hard. It would not be possible without them. And I'm done. Thank you. "14 minutes.
Okay, so many here will be familiar with the Dalai Lama's calls for more in-depth attention to a first-person science, and equally familiar with the pushback from a normative scientific model that unreflectively, even axiomatically, stipulates that science can only be characterized by a third-person objectivity. Contemplative studies as a discipline is on the forefront of this exploratory program engaged in making use of the tools of a first-person science. particularly in its impetus, as with this conference, to collate and compare methodological models that can bridge across first-person perspectives of the humanities to the well-trod methods of data analysis familiar within a third-person methodology of science. For this paper, pull one forward. This paper, I focus on some underlying philosophical implications of a first-person perspective, drawing from the 11th century medieval Indian philosopher and mystic Abhinavagupta on the Pratyabhijna, the doctrine of recognition, specifically in relation to a contemporary neuroscientific model, integrated information theory, IIT 3.0, with a soon-to-be coming new version as IIT 4.0. Abhinavagupta's philosophical model uses a first-person perspective as a primary ontology, with his model called at times the doctrine of subjectivity, ahantavada. What is unique about Abhinavagupta's formulation of the primacy of the first person is the Pratyabhijna's departure from other Indian idealist monisms such as Advaita Vedanta, in that Abhinava insists on the reality of the external world. I suggest that Abhinavagupta's philosophical insights can help us to think through some of the logical ramifications of a first-person perspective, specifically in Abhinavagupta's use of a first-person ontology as a way of bridging the mind-body gap, one of our biggest problems today in science and philosophy. In brief, give the next slide here. In brief, IIT 3.0's model of consciousness shares with Abhinavagupta's model a fundamental assertion that consciousness and matter are linked through an identity thesis. IIT 3.0 links the two through understanding information as containing both subjectivity, what they term intrinsic property, and at the same time, it has causal efficacy, which is what links it to materiality. It ties information to a material basis. That is, IIT accords a bivalency to the idea of information, where information functions in a dual fashion as something which is both material and mental at the same time. Abhinavagupta also employs this same logic of bivalency, understanding a fundamental component of consciousness as both material, that is, as the stuff that makes up an external world, and at the same time, indicative of an inner subjective awareness. He mediates his conception of subjectivity through the use of a novel term called vimarsha. I have that on a future slide, as what brings together the juxtaposition, the inner subjective mental component of experience in juxtaposition with the materiality of an external world. Okay, so I suggest that Abhinavagupta's use of the concept of vimarsha, bridge the gap between consciousness and matter, does so through locating subjectivity, a first-person perspective within matter and materiality, rather than finding subjectivity in a transcendent consciousness. So now, given that Tononi's use of information in IIT has been critiqued by philosophers like John Searle and others as being observer-centric, i.e. based on a third-person perspective, formulations of the kind of first-person subjectivity-based link between consciousness and materiality that Abhinavagupta points out presents some helpful structural conceptions to understand about how consciousness, particularly through a first-person ontology, might interface with physical causality. I argued in earlier work that Abhinavagupta's articulation of subjectivity helps to make explicit that IIT does in fact rely on subjectivity in IIT 3.0 model. In more recent publications, Tononi and his colleagues, they may have gotten this message. They refined their conception of IIT to more explicitly express the notion of subjectivity in their more recent formulations of the model. So I'm going to lay out the framework of some of my arguments here in very truncated, abbreviated fashion due to time constraints. For more substantive analysis, I refer my listeners to the following publications, which explicate the evidence in detail. And also, what I will present at the remaining time are 2 points. I'll outline the structure of IIT, and I will discuss for Marcia as affording a first-person perspective tied to materiality, matter, and the body. Okay, so Giulio Tononi began formulating IIT in the early 200s in collaboration with a number of other colleagues, including some recent collaborations with neuroscientist Christoph Koch, who has done extensive work on establishing the neural correlates of consciousness. The theory has been refined in the last 2 decades, including recent scientific testing of its hypotheses with the integration of integrated information, IIT 3.0, presented in a substantive, coherent, and technically precise version, outlining a theory and evidence supporting it, and anticipation of a newer version, IIT 4.0. IIT proposes a bold venture to think through the general impasse of how mentality connects to the materiality of the body. As Massimini and Tononi put it, is a quote, "How is it possible that something that affects the body, a burn, for example, provokes a response at a mental," on the next slide, provokes a response at a mental level, the sensation of pain, end quote. Perhaps the most radical element of the solution that IIT proposes is its starting point. It jettisons the last century's physicalist axioms seeking to derive consciousness from the matter of the brain, and instead begins with the phenomenology of experience. In other words, IIT does not begin from functional or behavioral physical elements. It does not begin by asking how this physical object, the brain, can give rise to consciousness. Instead, IIT begins by asserting our experience of consciousness as the one thing we can indubitably know. Thus, IIT flips the idea of a material starting point for consciousness on its head, arguing instead that any foundation for consciousness must begin prima facie from consciousness as a given. Pointing to Descartes' seminal insight, his cogito ergo sum, Massimini and Tononi argue that any theory hoping to understand consciousness must acknowledge the primacy of consciousness. IIT then identifies the necessary physical conditions for consciousness, including those elements that are universally present in any experience of consciousness, and only those elements which can be identified as immediate, indubitable, and incontestable. We can see here the influence from Descartes' cogito ergo sum in his discourse on the method of rightly conducting the reason, etc. And this is an influence that IIT explicitly evokes. Since there is never the sense of uncertainty over whether or not we are conscious, IIT posits experience as the grounding framework. To this, they add 5 axioms and 5 postulates, stating in this way that it entails that experience must necessarily correspond to a physical substrate for consciousness. This substrate consciousness, the 5 postulates that IIT proposes, is a key element of IIT's appeal. Even if IIT does not tell us where consciousness comes from, it does at least propose to map out precisely in what types of bodies we can expect to find it. It is especially in the postulates of the theory, in the physical corollaries, that IIT makes remarkable scientific headway. That is, in its articulation of precisely what types of physical structures are capable of exhibiting consciousness. Since the physical substrates for consciousness can be empirically tested to see if real-world data fits the hypotheses that IIT makes, some of which, surprisingly, are not what we would expect. For instance, IIT predicts that a photodiode exhibits a tiny amount of consciousness, while IBM's Watson and Siri on your iPhone, for that matter, they have a 0 measurement for consciousness. In this way, the theory offers the possibility of falsifiability on the level of empirical physical data. Moreover, IIT proposes to quantify the amount of consciousness present for any given system, calculated in terms of a precise numerical measurement, category called phi. IIT states that when a given person or system exhibits a certain quantity of phi, that system can be understood to have a first-person experience, that is, to be conscious. The quantity of consciousness thus is measured along a continuum. A given system can have more consciousness, maybe a a slug might have less. However, there's a cutoff point, a minimum amount of phi required for a system to instantiate a first person experience. Thus, even though IIT begins from the premise of experience and consciousness as a given, which is a somewhat taboo starting point for a physicalist scientific program mapping the neurology of consciousness, it is nevertheless resolutely embedded in a realism and a physicalism, which states that appropriately integrated physical structures, i.e. neurons or transistors, correspond to the qualia of a first-person experience. In this regard, even as IIT begins with the premise of consciousness, it does not try to pinpoint why consciousness is so fundamentally tied to a material substrate, the brain, nor to philosophically explore the ramifications that come from beginning from the perspective of a foundational consciousness. Abhinavagupta's articulation of Vimarsha is helpful that it makes explicit function of a first-person perspective, sentience, as intrinsically embedded within materiality, within the body, operating as a mechanism for linking consciousness and matter. Abhinava's panentheism operates as a dual aspect monism. Vimarsha makes up one pole, and it is always linked to prakasha, translated in turn as light, the light of consciousness, which makes objects appear, making up the other pole. Prakasha and Vimarsha map to the principles of knowledge and action, which in turn function as the modal bifurcation of light as knowledge and materiality as action. So Abhinava tells us the Prakasha, expansive light, and Vimarsha, active awareness, have the respective natures of a mutually inseparable knowledge and action, and that absolute Shiva alone is the highest ultimate body of all entities. So, and I have a couple of different quotes here. In this, Vimarsha is tied to the materiality of touch. It comes with the connotations of materiality and the idea of change and impermanence tied to the material world. In this dual aspect monism, the two are inextricably enmeshed and frames in terms of materiality of bodies, with Shiva as absolute reality, as an overarching exclusive body for everything that exists. Now, this metaphor of a body is not a mere rhetorical figure of speech, but rather necessary to Abhinavagupta's panentheism, precisely because Vimarsha embeds subjectivity within materiality. So, describing the dream state, Abhinavagupta says, universality is available to other people. Universality, its availability to other people, is contradicted in the waking state. And this is one of the things that makes Abhinavagupta's theory so much more helpful for contemporary science than, say, a earlier, say, Advaita Vedanta model, because his use of Vimarsha is what actually maps to what contemporary cognitive scientists think of it as consciousness. Okay, so he says, describing the dream state, he says its universality is contradicted in the waking state. It's considered to be a form of illusion in that its contents are broken by another manifestation which has more stability, that is, following it on the durability of Vimarsha, active awareness in the waking state. So Vimarsha as consciousness is not always present, and like IIT's measurement of phi, which disappears when in non-REM sleep or under the influence of an anesthetic like propofol, Vimarsha is also discontinuous in sleep states. Similarly, elsewhere, speaking about the degree to which some form of the object is retained in a state of deep sleep or dissolution, Abhinava quotes Utpaladeva's Ajata Pramatra Siddhi, which says, in the state of this is, he's talking about deep sleep, one's active awareness, Vimarsha, is discontinuous. In this respect, the term Vimarsha more closely tracks a contemporary neuroscientific understanding of consciousness because it accommodates the Western idea that consciousness is not something we have every moment, we lose it in deep sleep. Oh, seriously? Okay. 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 Oh, 5 minutes. Okay. All right. I might go get 5 minutes. Moreover, it is Vimarsha that signals consciousness as sentience. As Utpaladeva says, Vimarsha is the very nature of the manifestation of consciousness. Otherwise, even if light, prakasha, illuminates an object, it remains insentient, jarda, like a crystal. This is the kind of consciousness that IIT associates with phi. Consciousness is subjectivity, indicating a first-person experience, intrinsicality in terms of IIT's 5 axioms. It's the capacity for a first-person experience that characterizes sentiency. Vimarsha, Abhinava tells us, is what gives us the sense of self, unlike, for instance, an insentient stone like lapis lazuli, which lacks Vimarsha. So Vimarsha is not always operative, but when it is, then things become sentient. Without it, without Vimarsha, they are insentient. It may be argued that IIT suggests something akin to this when it postulates that existence is invariably tied to intrinsicality, which is really subjectivity, as that which is indubitable for every experience. Similarly, Tononi gestures towards this also when he argues that causality and free will are not properties that can play out on the level of the physical substrate, that is the brain's neurons. He points out that it's not the brain per se and its neurons causing an effect, but instead what actually exists is that cause-effect mechanism within the brain's neuronal components, which obtains a maximum phi, and it's thereby expressed through a first-person awareness. And I think I have a slide here for this where he says, maybe I don't have a slide here for this. Okay, where he says that the intrinsic existence view, I have alternatives, not my substrate, i.e. not the brain. In other words, causality and free will are properties tied to a first-person ontology, a first-person phenomenology. This recalls Abhinavagupta's assertion. Am I missing some of my? Oh, sorry. This recalls a first-person substitution that causality can only be ascribed to that which is sentient. He says it cannot be proved that the relation of cause and effect is grounded within that which lacks sentience. This is a big deal, by the way. But rather, the relation of cause and effect lies only within that which is conscious. This, I suggest, indicates that Tononi as well is functionally operating with a notion that subjectivity acts as a primary ontology. Abhinava's articulation of subjectivity as primary ontology, I venture, may be useful particularly for thinking through IIT's representation of materiality as cause-effect structures that rely on first-person experience as conscious sentience, since Abhinava frames Vimarsha as a subjectivity embedded in materiality. So I'm going to skip another long quote here. Let's see. In this respect, Vimarsha tied to sentience and the subjectivity is also tied to materiality of an externalized world. No doubt, Abhinavagupta here is searching for a solution to the intractable problem of a Sankhya dualism, which keeps consciousness separate from the realm of materiality, which is what we have today, by the way, in science as well. So Abhinava writes, Sankhya, however, does not accept that the self could be a, quote, I existing of active, materially engaged awareness. Vimarsha, we, however, acknowledge that the self does entail a capacity to do things. This is the pure active awareness, which is the I, in the form of unimpeded wonder of one's own self. With this, Abhinava relocates subjectivity, the I, squarely in the ballpark of an external world, materially based as the effects of action in a world. Okay, to sum up, what we might glean from all this is that Abhinavagupta's use of Vimarsha inverts the normative pattern of consciousness as transcendent subjectivity detached from the world. Instead, through Vimarsha, tying an inward sense of subjectivity to materiality, the action and matter of the world. This allows him to propose a non-dualism that does not exclude materiality, does not exclude the ordinary world around us. Abhinavagupta's emphasis on Vimarsha, its links to action, and by extension to the material world, affords a key to understanding how his model does not devolve into a simple idealism. More than this, though, for our purposes here, this notion of Vimarsha can prompt us to think about our current materialist conception connecting consciousness with brain matter via a neuronal correspondence model in a way that conceives matter and materiality as more intrinsic to the process of life and sentience, not just as a mere inert capacity to instantiate it. Okay, thank you. Hope I didn't whisk it too quickly.
Good to see all of you friends and colleagues. I'm Eric Garland. I'm a clinical biobehavioral scientist by day. I'm going to be talking to you about my night job. This is the night job. The opioid crisis has been termed a disease of despair in the sociological literature. And I don't think this term is a mere metaphor. I think it strikes right at the heart of the pathogenic mechanisms that are driving this crisis. To understand this claim, we need to understand the role that hedonic dysregulation plays in pain, pleasure, and addiction. Traditionally, in Western philosophy, pleasure and pain have been considered opposites on a hedonic balance, such that increasing experiences of pain are thought to outweigh the experience of pleasure in everyday life. Neurobiology indicates that pleasure and pain operate through a common emotional currency in the brain, mediated by the mesocortical limbic dopamine circuit and the endogenous opioid system. And these same brain systems become hijacked by addictive drugs like opioids, in which chronic exposure to drug use causes neuroplastic changes that increase sensitization to pain, stress, and drug-related cues, while reducing sensitivity to the pleasure and meaning derived from naturally rewarding objects and events in the social environment. So in other words, as the individual becomes more dependent on opioids to feel okay, they become less able to extract a natural sense of healthy pleasure from everyday life, and this drives them to take higher and higher doses of the drug to preserve a dwindling sense of well-being. But over time, opioid use and pain become entrenched as automatic habits and entangled into the default mode of the self, ultimately leading to the downward spiral of loss of self-control over opioid use that's characteristic of addiction. So when I say pain becomes entangled into the default mode of the self, what do I mean? If you say I'm in pain enough times, eventually that little preposition in gets dropped, and I am in pain becomes I am pain, as one's primary identity becomes fused to chronic pain. Similarly, repeated ruminative thoughts about addiction and cravings can result in addiction becoming entangled into the default mode of the self. Over time and through the process of incentive salience, the drug gains primary self-relevance. It becomes the central point of meaning in life at the expense of non-drug related rewards, and thus addiction becomes fused with one's identity. Therefore, targeting self-referential processing in the treatment of chronic pain and addiction may become an important focus for our work. As we know, the default mode network becomes active in subserve self-referential processing in the resting state. But when one is cognitively engaged in a demanding task, activity in the default mode network decreases and theta oscillations begin to increase in medial prefrontal cortical brain midline regions. And so in effect then, frontal midline theta has been shown to be a biomarker of default mode activity. Frontal midline theta increases across a range of cognitive control tasks and is thought to be instantiated by brain structures like the medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate. And frontal theta is thought to signal a shift from prefrontal deliberative control over action selection to habitual striatal control of action selection. And so therefore, theta may signal awareness and regulation of automaticity. This is relevant to the treatment of addiction because addiction involves maladaptive automaticity, automatic habits driving drug seeking. And addiction is known to involve aberrant activity in the default mode network, with hyperactivity in the posterior cingulate cortex and decreased functional connectivity between the medial prefrontal cortex and the rest of the default mode network. At the same time, mindfulness-based interventions have been shown to modulate the default mode network and to stimulate theta oscillations in the brain. But few studies have examined whether mindfulness-based therapies can increase frontal midline theta in patients with clinical disorders. And to our knowledge, no studies have examined whether mindfulness-induced theta mediates the treatment effect of mindfulness on opioid use. So I sought to test the following hypotheses. Number one, that frontal midline theta would mediate the effect of mindfulness-based intervention on reducing opioid use. And number two, that mindfulness-induced frontal midline theta will be associated with alterations in self-referential processing characterized by the experience of self-transcendence, as well as internal reward states. To test this hypothesis, I studied mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement, which is a mindfulness-based intervention that I developed to simultaneously address addiction, stress, and chronic pain. MORE is a sequence treatment. It begins with the foundation of mindfulness training, which by virtue of strengthening attentional control and meta-awareness, is used to synergize more elaborate therapeutic techniques like reappraisal and savoring, and ultimately lead towards self-transcendence, the sense of being connected to something greater than the self. These treatment components are intended to modulate a series of therapeutic mechanisms, including inducing self-referential plasticity through direct pointing instructions. And these treatment mechanisms are intended to produce clinically significant change in a range of treatment targets relevant to chronic pain and opioid misuse. MORE is an evidence-based treatment. Recently, a meta-analysis of all the randomized controlled trials of MORE was published, showing that across studies, MORE produces statistically significant effects in reducing addictive behaviors, psychiatric symptoms, and chronic pain, compared to a range of active control conditions. To highlight one such study, the largest RCT of MORE was published last year in JAMA Internal Medicine. In this R01 funded trial, there were 250 opioid misusing chronic pain patients who were randomized to 8 weeks of MORE or 8 weeks of a supportive group psychotherapy control condition. Patients were taking high opioid doses at baseline, 101 morphine milligram equivalents a day on average. In summary of the findings, we found that MORE reduced opioid misuse by 45% at the 9-month follow-up point, nearly tripling the effect of standard supportive psychotherapy. MORE also reduced opioid craving from moment to moment. And at the same time, MORE significantly reduced chronic pain symptoms and emotional distress, with 50% of patients reporting clinically significant pain relief following 8 weeks of treatment. We've done a fair amount of mechanistic work to try to understand how this therapy works, and we've shown using EEG that MORE works to decrease attentional responses to drug cues and to increase responses to natural healthy rewards. But what about the effects of MORE on self-referential processing? The first 2 decades of mindfulness science focused on mechanisms of mindfulness, including attention regulation and emotion regulation. But the original soteriological purpose of mindfulness was not merely to regulate attention or emotion, but rather to recognize the fundamental non-duality between the self and the world, also known as self-transcendence in the psychological literature. We typically experience ourselves as an isolated subject, identified with our bodies and encapsulated by the skin, seeking out the objects of the world that we desire. But there can be moments when that normal subject-object dichotomy begins to fade, where the sense of self becomes quiet, and we feel a sense of closeness, interconnectedness, or oneness with the world around us. And at the same time, we're filled with this sense of all-pervading peace, compassion, and bliss. These experiences can happen, for example, when you're at the concert of your favorite band, and you become so absorbed in the music and the lights that you lose all sense of yourself and are filled with the thrilling bliss of the musical notes. It can happen when you're at the beach watching a beautiful sunset, like what I hope to do with all of you this evening. And the sense of self becomes quiet. You feel a sense of limitless expansiveness and a connection to all things. These experiences can happen under the influence of psychedelic drugs like psilocybin. And they can and do occur during meditation. We need to be able to quantify these states if we want to understand them scientifically. So to that end, my colleagues Adam Hanley, Yoshi Nakamura, and I developed the Non-Dual Awareness Dimensional Assessment, or NADA, which is a psychometrically sound and reliable measure that has strong convergent and divergent validity. So we have a sensitive measure to capture this construct. And having validated the NADA as an assessment tool, it's now possible to rank order experiences in terms of the degree of self-transcendence elicited by these experiences. These are data that I've collected across multiple studies to date. And although this is a fledgling attempt here, it's a first start, in my opinion, the comparative study of self-transcendence has great transformative potential for the field of contemplative science and psychedelic studies. And what other experiences can we begin to assess and rank on this scale? So using the NADA, we found that mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement significantly increases experiences of self-transcendence and affective bliss through a 9-month follow-up point. We wondered how experiences of self-transcendence evoked during deep meditative states might help to reduce addictive behavior. So in a recent mechanistic experiment published in Neuropsychopharmacology, we found that veterans with opioid-treated chronic pain participating in MORE showed significantly greater frontal midline theta EEG oscillations during mindfulness meditation compared to those in the control group. Increases in frontal midline theta, EEG, were associated with more intense reports of self-transcendence during meditation and statistically mediated the effect of more on reducing opioid use 4 months later. We recently replicated these findings in the largest neuroscientific study of mindfulness as a treatment for addiction published to date. This was published 2 months ago in Science Advances. In this study, there were 165 chronic opioid users, again, participating in more or supportive therapy. We brought them into the lab and asked them to meditate while we measured their theta, and again found that more significantly increased frontal midline theta. Increases in frontal midline theta during meditation were predictive of self-transcendent experiences and mediated the effect of more on reducing opioid misuse through a 9-month follow-up. Replicating these results across 2 independent randomized controlled trials with 2 independent samples suggests that we may have indeed found a key mechanism by which mindfulness reduces addictive behavior. But why would an increased marker of cognitive control be linked with non-dual awareness? Mindfulness meditation involves intensive recruitment of cognitive control resources to inhibit self-referential thought during the focus of attention on the meditative object. The repeated cultivation of one-pointed attention during meditation is thought to deepen into a state of absorption, also known as samadhi in Sanskrit. And when attentional absorption reaches its zenith and self-referential thought is quelled, attention can finally be released as the subject-object distinction falls away during an experience of non-dual awareness. Speculatively, non-dual awareness might produce a potent experience of natural reward and stimulus-independent happiness, linked with increased theta oscillations in the medial prefrontal cortex and increased integration of task-positive brain networks involved in sensory processing with task-negative brain networks involved in self-referential processing. Modulating functional connectivity patterns through meditatively induced non-dual awareness might reset aberrant default mode network function subserving chronic pain and addiction, and also facilitate restructuring of reward processing and corticostriatal circuitry underlying addictive behavior. And we do have evidence that more increases internal reward responses. Here's data from a computerized body map where patients locate pleasant and unpleasant sensations. Pleasant sensations are represented in blue, unpleasant sensations are represented in red, and the density of the hue indicates the frequency with which a given part of the body is identified as feeling pleasant or unpleasant. Here you can see that more massively increased pleasant sensations in the body and powerfully shifted sensations in the body itself from being a place of anguish to becoming a place of refuge, and in fact, a source of internal reward. By teaching patients how to make themselves feel good naturally, they may be less reliant on an external substance like a drug to feel good. Taken together, these data mirror the wisdom of the ancients. For example, take these words from the non-dual Shaiva Tantra. Awareness is the cause of the completion of everything, meaning its resorption. That is, she brings about the fusion of everything, complete non-duality, causing one to relish all things as a seamless unity. Say Maharaja, the disciple of Abhinavagupta. Or, when the yogi is established in pure awareness, his craving is destroyed. Thus, he savors his inherently blissful nature, which illumines itself with the rays of his consciousness. At that very moment, the yogi abandons the craving. So taken together, this body of work supports the restructuring reward hypothesis that suggests that increasing sensitization to natural, healthy pleasure, joy, meaning, and self-transcendence will come to outweigh the pull of drug-related reward and thereby reduce addictive behavior, It should be noted that the effects of self-transcendence go beyond mere hedonic pleasure. They tap into eudaimonic processes, including compassion and empathy. We see that in our data, that mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement increases psychological experiences that are linked with empathy and compassion, the sense of merging with others and experiencing a universal love. And indeed, self-transcendence may prove to be one key substrate of compassion, empathy. So in conclusion, Mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement is an efficacious treatment for chronic pain and opioid misuse, as demonstrated by 5 randomized controlled trials involving more than 700 patients. 2 independent RCTs replicate the following: that more increases frontal midline theta during mindfulness practice, and these effects on theta mediate the effect of more on reducing addictive behavior. Frontal midline theta appears to be associated with tastes of self-transcendence and non-duality during meditation. The endogenous theta stimulation produced by non-dual states might reset aberrant default mode network dysfunction that is integral to a range of psychiatric conditions. But non-dual awareness and self-transcendence may have another function as well, which is to stimulate and subserve experiences of compassion and empathy. And finally, in my opinion, the study of meditation-induced self-transcendence and non-dual awareness, as well as its mechanisms and clinical outcomes, is the next frontier of contemplative science. And I would really welcome all of you to join me in this journey to uncover and understand the implications of this work from
Madhyamaka. And I don't hold a kind of monist or pantheist perspective coming from a Vedantic tradition. So that might be my training, my own ontology and so forth. But I know that if I say certain words and have a certain affect in how I'm opening up the space and how I'm guiding people's visual gaze to expand into a panoramic horizon and including sense perceptions, I know what that does to students. But that's almost like a style or an aesthetic. And how do we locate that delivery system in our research? That's my question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
It's a wonderful question. I mean, it goes to the issue of the teacher-student relationship very directly, and it emphasizes the importance of having a good guide and having a good teacher, and also of the concept. We've talked a lot in this conference about frameworks. I would say conceptual or cognitive frameworks in which we're doing different things. We're doing research or we're doing teaching of meditation. And the implicit framework is important. The explicit framework is important. What you actually enunciate as a teacher. So that role of teacher is very crucial. I don't know. I mean, I'm assuming that in the research that you both, in the scientific research, that you're very consistent in what's being taught and how it's being taught, and that controls for what Adam's asking about.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things I think, and this goes, in a way, it goes back to what the two of you were saying, and that is that both of you were saying, like, well, I just look at the data. You know, I try not to intrude, and it's a certain kind of skill set. It takes a certain kind of skill set to actually sort of be present with what you're doing. Okay, and that's looking at the data as well. You know, so we're I'm overlaying a contemplative sort of trope on top of what they're doing with the science. Okay, and it's the same thing with you as a teacher. So if there's always a sort of like, okay, I have a program, I want to sort of generate a state of like openness, my empty void. But then sometimes what you as a teacher can also do is that you can recognize that here I am in this space in the world, and I'm recalling this one word, and I'm bringing up a certain sensory perception. My students are picking up on it as well. And then what happens in that moment is you yourself can also sort of shift out of a sort of a classic emptiness state into a state that sort of borders on something maybe more aligned to, you know, the sensory capacities of smelling a rose and, you know, or whatever. And that will then sort of lead you into a slightly different experience, meditative type experience. So, you know, we make these sort of, I think, sort of false barriers between, say, the non-dualism of Buddhism and the non-dualism of, say, Abhinavagupta's, and then sort of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And that really, all of these people are talking about certain types of experiences and sort of then framing them in one particular way, which they thought was most effective as a teacher. And it's the same thing with your teaching as a Buddhist teacher as well. But you can also shift out of that a little and grasp something else as well. I think of, I don't, was it Haklin or someone, I think, who at one point said that, you know, there's this sort of celebration of Zen masters as being the only ones that know, but then he was saying that some people who are, you know, sort of, you know, sutra reciters, Pure Land sutra reciters, they can also get to exactly the same path, exactly the same point of enlightenment. So I mean, and I'm not a huge advocate of like, all paths lead up the mountain, Ramakrishna's statement, but there is this still idea that you as a person can sort of vary what you experience and what you teach and what you convey to students. And then you will also sort of be, dipping into this other territory, beyond the sort of like simple emptiness into a more sort of embodied, maybe not a more embodied, say, Kashmiri non-dualism. And so you have that capacity, I think, as a human to sort of like expand out into these different experiences and to break, in a sense, sometimes break out of the boxes of what we think an enlightenment experience is as well. And that's, and it's always a modulation, just as it is with your science as well. Like we're always going back and forth and like, oh, I've learned something new in that process, or yeah.
Thanks, Lorelei. Fadl or Eric, any comments on the actual teaching of the practices?
I would just say that when we started doing this work, we were not doing such a heavy degree of direct pointing to non-dual awareness. But when we developed the non-dual awareness dimensional assessment, we discovered that nonetheless, people were reporting this experience. Total novices were reporting this experience with very little bit of mindfulness training. And we saw that and said, well, that this is kind of remarkable that this is happening. So now that we've discovered this, we're more interested in developing mindfulness training protocols and procedures that emphasize non-dual experience. So now we're going to attempt to actually tailor the meditation techniques to accentuate this phenomenon. But originally it was arising out of very little direct pointing. And I think you see that with Fadl's work, who's teaching a very simple bare attention practice to the breath with no emphasis, direct, explicit emphasis on non-dual awareness. And yet he's seeing the neural substrates of it.
That's right. Go ahead, Justin.
Thank you for your question, Adam.
So this is a neuroscience question. I thought it was really fascinating to see these novel mechanisms that you were presenting today. And it seems as if there's a downshifting of the default mode network that overlaps amongst both of your findings. In Eric's case, there was this purported frontal midline theta route by which you would actually shift the default mode. And then in Fadl's case, it seemed more like a thalamic to posterior cingulate precuneus route. And I'm just curious to hear your guys' take on this anterior versus posterior distinction. Is one route more primal than others, or could both routes get you to the same place?
Great question. And I think this is important. What Eric is teaching is different than what our group is teaching. So, Eric's more is been designed to, and correct me if I'm wrong, to target opiate-using chronic pain patients, and it seems to be generalizable to other patient populations and healthies. It's a multimodal approach that's based in mindfulness, but integrates many, many other things, because treating pain is complicated, so you need to use a multimodal approach. Ours is, we've been adding very simple instructions, because the idea is to use a very brief intervention to promote the clinical applicability of using these techniques for everyday folks. And so, having done this work primarily in North Carolina, we've had to really shift the way that we teach mindfulness to make it as simple as possible and provide them as little instructions as possible so that they could struggle through the practice and then use the teacher. I found some teachings can be very verbose, and the instructors just, Zen, you could probably appreciate this, Hal, from the Zen tradition, where there's very little instruction. And there's a reason for that, right? So you can, and so,
Find it on your own.
that's right. You find it on your own. That's going to be your best teacher. Now, to get your question, Justin, there are also different techniques. Yeah. Were your guys meditating
When?
during the theta findings?
Yes.
Yeah. So what were they doing explicitly? What did you ask them to do?
The instruction?
Yeah.
We intentionally tried to give nondescript instructions to both groups because we didn't want to teach the controls how to meditate. So the instruction was Now practice mindfulness, which means focusing on your present moment experience without reacting to it or judging it.
Right.
That was it. So very, very nondescript, because we assumed that the people who had 8 weeks of training with more would be able to do this, whereas those who were only in supportive therapy could not.
Right. And we use similar, we say, well, we teach them in shamatha, and I would say kiss of Vipassana. We just ask them to meditate, to begin practicing mindfulness, because in many of our conditions, we've created a sham mindfulness meditation intervention where many people think they're practicing mindfulness, but really they're just practicing some form of a pranayama, deep breathing, without the cognitive reappraisal component or no appraisal component of mindfulness. So it's more of a directive. I guess, Justin, it's not as simple, but I think the differences in mechanisms are likely because there's different practices being engaged. And that is a task for us as a community, as a society, is to get really specific about what we're actually teaching people and what people are actually practicing. I'm not trying to lecture anyone, but the word mindfulness can be quite problematic, and it has been problematic for 20 years, ever since the first Mind and Life, Summer Research Institute. So for the sake of your patients, for the sake of your students, let's just operationalize what they're practicing. What is the recipe? And maybe stray away from using terms of mindfulness. Also, the paper that came out today is called Mindfulness Meditation, Base Pain Relief. So I should follow my own advice.
And I would add to that about your question, how do we resolve this dichotomy between this anterior versus posterior model? I think it can be resolved temporally, not in my data yet, but I think that as I tried to emphasize, the increased cognitive control that is required during repeated placement of attention on the meditative object ultimately results in the collapse of the subject-object dichotomy as attention reaches this high state of absorption. So this is it's a highly, prefrontally mediated approach, which is the pathway in to the experience of self-transcendence or non-duality. But that theta finding, I don't think it's not the mechanism of self-transcendence. It's the marker of the attentional process that then leads to the state, which may involve this more posterior, not cognitively effortful, self-driven process, but rather this decoupling, this default mode decoupling, and very much more of a bottom-up kind of process that Fadl is seeing. So I think you probably see stages of it. You need to focus intensely first to reach the state, and then once the state is achieved, then there's the relaxation of all of that, and it falls away. So I think we need more temporally dynamic models to capture this. Probably need combined EEG and fMRI to do this right, to capture the changing phases of the experience.
I'd just like to add to this discussion as a scholar and a historian of Buddhism and Taoism that I always urge my students to be very specific about how they use the term mindfulness. Mindfulness, if you look at Bhikkhu Bodhi's article in that Contemporary Buddhism Journal, there's a special issue on mindfulness. It's a translation for the Pali term sati, and sati literally means to remember. Okay, so how does to remember relate to all of this? The way in which mindfulness has become used is as a general, more respectable term for meditation. And it kind of helped meditation get established in the larger society. But it's really been applied in scientific research to a wide range of directions for practice. I like Eric's suggestion that you say repeated placement of the attention on a meditation object. And I really feel like that's getting very close to what mindfulness actually is. It's remembering to come back again and again and again to that meditation object, because our tendency with rumination is to go off and not focus on that. So when you remember to come back, that's the way in which the term, I think, is originally used. And I underline first of all, it's never used in Zen. I mean, I've spent 40 years practicing with a really old school Japanese Zen master. Not once did he ever use the word mindfulness. So Anyway, it's important to be more consistent about the use of the term and to be more specific from a scholarly point of view. And that, I think, will help determine the types of will influence the types of results you're getting, and perhaps make them more consistent.
You guys are gonna have to